The meeting is going to take the form of some short talks about the articles in our most recent book, our Miscellany volume. There will be a chance to ask questions at the end of the meeting. You'll be able to do that either by using the chat function in the middle of your screen, which you can use at any time, and we'll pick up those chat comments at the end, or at the end of the meeting, if you wish to unmute yourself, then you're very welcome to do that, so that you can actually ask a question in the traditional way. Members of the Society should already have received the copy of the Miscellany volume, which this meeting is about. After the meeting, I intend to circulate to the non-members details about how they can buy a copy of the volume. So that will become available after the end of the meeting. So it's my great pleasure now to introduce Chris Hindle. Chris is currently our editor, so he's not only responsible for contributing to the volume, but he's also done an excellent job, as I think everyone who's seen the volume will agree, in putting together a really excellent Miscellany volume. So I'll hand over now to Chris to introduce the rest of the event. Thank you, Chris.
Okay, thank you, Alan. I'm going to go on to my screen share now to get the slides up. So, good afternoon, and welcome to this talk to introduce the Thorsby Society's new Miscellany volume. We're going to hear from some of the contributors. Irfan Shah, who has written a substantial piece on the work of the 19th century filmmaker Louise Prince. And continuing the French theme, Robert Demaine will tell us about his research into a trip made by a 300-strong Leeds Choir to Paris in 1906. And Roy Yates will talk to us about his research into the Tudor Reformation in Leeds. I'm going to begin by talking about my own article on the rise and fall of the Leeds merchant and manufacturing house, Hudson Sykes Bousfield, a business that had its origins in the once highly profitable Leeds cloth merchant trade, but later switched to manufacturing cloth themselves, embarking on a 70-year roller coaster ride as it focused on making quality products and turning a profit in often challenging trading conditions. I'll also provide an introduction to Peter Brears' article on brewing at Kirkstall between 1152 and 1983, and conclude by briefly touching on Elizabethan Potter Newton and the Hardwick family, an article written by Michael Collinson. The only visible sign of Hudson Sykes Bousfield in Leeds today is the ghost signage high up on the front of their old building at 19 Wellington Street, an extremely attractive building designed by the prominent Leeds architect George Corson in 1858 as showrooms, offices and warehousing. It was a perfect location for a woolen merchant, close to the town's railway stations and also the mixed cloth hall, and which of course was situated in modern day City Square. This is an extract from Ratkin's 1850 map of Leeds, where we can see that the eastern end of Wellington Street led onto a road which was then called Green Hill, and which a few years later became an extension of Wellington Street, where number 19 is situated. It must have been a pleasant spot with an open garden or square over the road in front of it, seen here in the picture, looking north towards the old infirmary where the Yorkshire Bank now stands. Hudson Sykes Bousfield was a merger of two old established Leeds merchant houses, John Sykes and Sons and Hudson Bousfield. After John died in 1858, his son Alfred entered into partnership with Henry Hudson and Charles Bousfield. Henry had been a juror at the Great Exhibition in 1851, and Charles was able to boast that he came from a class and an age of Englishmen that would strain every nerve to maintain, extend, and consolidate business. He would play a prominent role in the formation of the world-famous textile department at the Yorkshire College, later Leeds University, being formally invited to open the department in 1878. With many textile manufacturers preparing to cut out the merchants or the middlemen and sell their own cloth, some merchants turned to manufacturing themselves, a route adopted by Hudson Sykes Bousfield when they bought the Springfield Mill Estate at Morley in 1872. Comprising of around 17 acres, it included a fine house where the mill manager lived, a small farm, and even a bed of coal. During the early years, the mill's 600-strong workforce made union cloth, which was a product at the lower end of the market, so called because it comprised of a union of cotton warp and other materials such as reclaimed mungo and shoddy, described by Bousfield as a marvel of ingenuity and manipulation of materials. A French critic at the 1878 Paris exhibition commented that the Morley Union cloth was to the fine cloths of the west of England what plated goods are to real silver. The attraction, of course, was providing a good product that people could reasonably afford. In later years, the firm developed a very high reputation for its fancy goods, worsteds and tweeds, which were marketed across the world, especially in Canada, where they had a branch office in Montreal. Although the business was largely successful, trading conditions never seemed to be easy. As an example, in 1875, there were 57 cloth mills in the borough of Leeds, but within 10 years, half of them had either contracted or closed. There seemed to be that little bit of extra dynamism about Hudson Sykes Bousfield, which helped keep them afloat. Charles Bousfield summarized the philosophy that he and other business leaders needed to be successful. He said that they had to understand the spirit of the age and to have an ability to surpass the competition, to survive and endure, which could only be achieved by being the strongest and the fittest. One thing that the firm could do nothing about was a jinx, a series of tragic losses of younger members of the founding families whose destiny it should have been to lead the firm. The death of Alfred's grandson, Gerald, killed in the First World War, shot dead in the trenches on the 25th of May, 1915, aged 18, and Alfred's own death the following year ended the Sykes family's involvement with the business. This picture shows the naming on Gerald's Victory Medal, which was discovered for sale on eBay a few years ago. After the early deaths of two of Henry Hudson's sons, his grandson Edwin was fast-tracked and appointed a director of the company in 1913, aged 22. And it's important to remember that at this time and after the First World War, Leeds was the wholesale clothing centre of Britain, if not the world, an industry which was, of course, reliant on the supply of good quality local cloth. So there was reason for optimism, and all the more so when in March 1934, whilst exhibiting in London at the company's whilst they were exhibiting in London, the company's botany tweed suitings attracted the attention of no less a fashion icon than this man, the Prince of Wales, the future Edward VIII, who asked for samples of the patterns to be sent to him. He also bought 2 scarves on the day, selecting a check variety in yellow and black and another in all black. But in reality, the woolen cloth industry was facing major problems caused by both overproduction of cloth across the industry, resulting in cutthroat price wars as firms sought to find buyers for unsold stock, and also high tariffs in the foreign markets, causing the valuable export trade to collapse. So with no viable market for its cloth, the directors now took the drastic step of closing the manufacturing part of the mill on 26 September 1934. But the aim that when conditions improved, it would reopen. This never happened. Edwin Hudson became the latest member of the 3 families to fall to an early death, passing away aged just 43 in July 1935, resulting in the Springfield estate being quickly sold on to the young, dynamic Bradford firm, Heel Brothers, who re-engaged 486 members of staff and very soon successfully returned all departments at the mill to operate at near full capacity in terms of both orders and production. The next article I'm going to touch on is by Peter Brears, who's written an account of brewing at Kirkstall, which started at the Abbey after it was founded in 1152 and carried on until the dissolution in 1539, after which the old brewery became a commercial malt house. In the early 1830s, a new brewery was established at Kirkstall, near Kirkstall Lock, which we can see in the Turner painting in this slide. This was a period when drinking cheap gin had become so popular that nationally drunkenness had reached disastrous levels. The introduction of the 1830 Beer House Act made it easier for people to buy beer, and the hope was that this would encourage a switch in drinking habits, with beer regarded as much less of a problem than gin. Any householder wealthy enough to be assessed for the poor law rate now became eligible for a 2-guinea excise licence to retail beer for consumption both on and off his own premises between 4 AM and 10 PM at night. And not surprisingly, this led to an explosion in the number of beer houses, with tens of thousands of unsupervised and disorderly little beer houses being set up throughout the country. So this was a good time to own a brewery. And throughout the second half of the 19th century, Kirkstall Brewery expanded. Beer was even imported to Australia and New Zealand, with hogsheads containing 54 gallons of beer carried down the Ayr and Calder Canal to Goole, where the company had its own steamships, the SS Charente and the SS Kirkstall, which were acquired in 1896. Whitbreads acquired Kirkstall Brewery in 1954 and began brewing 1,200 barrels of Mackeson's stout every week. But by the early 1980s, times were a-changing, partly as a result of a period of recession and partly due to many of the heavy industries which had created a copious thirst for beer being in rapid decline. To remain competitive, Whitbread reduced capacity and Kirkstall Brewery was closed in January 1983 as they focused on brewing in Yorkshire at the Exchange Brewery in Sheffield. Leeds City Council, rather optimistically, announced that the building would be turned into a brewing museum with a high-class pub and restaurant where visitors would be able to view the old equipment and watch beer being brewed. It never happened, and the majority of the brewery remained unused for 10 years. But there was a happy ending, as during the 1990s, the whole brewery was converted into student housing and became one of the city's finest examples of the reuse of a large, redundant, listed industrial building. And we can see the new flats bottom left in that slide. Now, just before I hand over to Irfan Shah, I would like to mention our cover illustration for the publication, which is an Elizabethan fresco from the tomb of Thomas Hardwick in Leeds Minster. When Margaret Pullen's work on the monuments of the church was published in 2007, it was observed that little was known of the Hardwicks of Potter Newton. Well, I'm happy to say that this has now been rectified with our publication of Michael Collinson's latest article in the Miscellany on the very subject. And now over to you, Irfan. I'll put the first slide on for your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Hello, everybody. I'm going to talk about just two particular aspects of the article that I've written on the inventor Louis Prince, who you can see here on the left of the slide, alongside a frame from one of his films, which was taken on Leeds Bridge. So in 1888, the French inventor Louis Prince shot what many people now consider to be the world's first ever true films. And that is really the capture of continuous motion and projecting it back onto a screen for an audience as well. And he did all that in Leeds, but he never got the chance to tell the world about what he'd achieved, because on September the 16th, 1890, and just before he was expected to sail to New York to demonstrate his films in public for the first time, the Prince boarded the Dijon to Paris train and he was never seen again. Now, anyone who has heard of Le Prince, and quite a few people have, anyone who's heard of him know about these two things really, the idea of firstness and the question of his disappearance. And so the piece that I've written for the Thoresby Society was an opportunity to do something slightly different. And I've written about Le Prince's time in Leeds in particular, but I've also done it in such a way that I hope I've moved past the ideas of firstness and of disappearance, because I think it's really necessary to do that in order to actually appreciate what his actual achievements really were, and also to appreciate the part that Leeds played in these achievements. Because Le Prince didn't just happen to shoot his films in Leeds. It was a town that was really instrumental to his work. And I'm not sure how well known it is that Leeds was actually at the cutting edge of photographic innovation, even before Le Prince got here in 1866. And I'm just going to give you just a few examples of what I mean. The third ever photographic society in the world, after Paris and New York, was started here in Leeds. The first photographs to be taken through a microscope were taken by a Leeds scientist, Joseph Bancroft Reed. One of the first, and perhaps even the first, rotating shutters for a camera was invented here. There were links here to John Waterhouse of Halifax, who invented the world's first camera aperture system. And in terms of film, and independent of Le Prince, the next people to make films after him were Wordsworth Donisthorpe, who was born in Leeds, and his co-inventor, William Carr Crofts, who was working in Leeds as a lawyer. And there's actually a lot more to be said that was happening here. And so I really feel that there is a hidden history or a forgotten history of photography and film in Leeds that hasn't actually been properly explored yet. And so I hope that the article that I've written will perhaps point the way for future research in this respect. If we move to the next slide then, please, Chris, and we can see his beautiful cameras here. So, Louis Prince, who was born in France in 1841, he was an artist and an engineer who came to Leeds in 1866. He lived and worked and started a family here. He involved himself in the social and intellectual circles of the day. He moved to the United States for around 6 years in the 1880s, but he then returned in order to build his single lens camera, which is the one on the left that you can see. And it's the one on which his reputation really rests, I think. And I should say that as an engineer, as an inventor, he was absolutely brilliant. This camera here, which you can see, it survives. It's in the National Science and Media Museum in Bradford. This took films that were of a much higher quality than many cameras that came after it in subsequent years. But he had an earlier camera, and if you look to the picture on the right, you can see the remains of it. And you can see that this camera had 16 lenses. There's a grid of 4x4 lenses at the front, you see. I'll just explain very quickly how this works, because this is quite interesting. The shutters go off one at a time. So you would see it would take 16 images in quick succession, and then it would go back to the beginning and take another 16, and that's how you built up the sequence. But you could actually reconfigure the shutters quite easily, so they would take 2 images at a time. And that's important because that is how Le Prince had hoped to capture stereographic images. In other words, to make films in 3D. Now, there were millions of stereographic still images in the 19th century, and the science behind it was well understood. In very crude terms, if you take 2 pictures of something from very slightly different perspectives, the brain merges them together in 3D. And this is what Le Prince wanted for this particular camera as well. So not only do we have this beautiful Leeds-made single lens camera that took the wonderful films that we know about, he also had an earlier camera that he was hoping to take 3D films with at some point. However, in addition to these wonderful cameras, Le Prince had also suggested syncing his films with gramophones in order to have films with sound. And in addition to that, his years in Leeds in the 1870s as an artist, where he fixed photographic images onto ceramics and coloured them, gave him everything that he needed to know to be able to colour his films, which is also what he wanted to do eventually as well. So we have this wonderful single lens camera, a camera that he was hoping to shoot 3D films with, the awareness of how to make films with sound and in colour as well. Now, these are all technological things, but in addition to that as well, Le Prince had a very strong sense of how film might one day be exploited commercially as well. It was based on the idea of the panoramas of the 19th century, the giant circular paintings that people came to see. So Le Prince felt that these static images could one day be brought to life. And so he had a real sense of films as public spectacle, as a communal event. And he saw them not just as entertainment, but he saw them as education as well. He felt that motion pictures would mean shared experiences between nations. And so he also had a sense of what film might mean culturally to a society as well. And in addition to all of that, his films were also just very visually interesting, well shot and well framed. And I think that is one of the things that perhaps has been forgotten about Le Prince in our obsession with the idea of firstness, because we've perhaps forgotten to simply look at his work. So if we have the next slide, we will see some frames from his work. I'm going to start on the right-hand side, I think, because that's a frame from Leeds Bridge Scene. And you can see that the road itself cuts this pleasing diagonal line right through the frame. This was shot from an upper window of Hicks Brothers Ironmongers that was on the southeast corner of Bridge End. And that's one of the surviving films. I should say these are fragments of films that were originally much longer. And also there were more films shot than have survived as well. So he actually, I think, had quite a collection. But that's Leeds Bridge Scene. If we go to the far left, we have a frame for what we now know as Roundhay Garden Scene. Now, this was shot on October the 14th, 1888, on the grounds of Le Prince's father-in-law's house, Roundhay Cottage. And his father-in-law and his mother-in-law are actually both in it, Joseph and Sarah Whitley, along with Le Prince's son, Adolphe, and a family friend named Annie Hartley. Now, in this sequence that survives, only about 1 or 2 seconds survive, and you can see it quite easily online. The two women sort of wander around, step up and down a little bit, whilst the two men tread these circular paths around them that are quite obviously designed to keep them within shot at all times. It's actually a really charming little moment. We also have in the centre the accordion scene, and we see Adolphe Le Prince again playing accordion, and both Roundhay Garden and accordion scene were obviously shot at the same location, but apparently we believe on the same day as well. And I just want to comment quickly here, because it's something that struck me, that Le Prince cared enough about the look of his shots to move all his bulky equipment just a few yards to get shots that were aesthetically satisfying. So with Roundhay Garden, we have quite a wide shot to get 4 figures in, but he pulls in tighter for the accordion scene so we can see Adolphe's smiling face, and he's almost framed by the pillars behind him. And it reminds us that Le Prince was an artist as well as an engineer. And it's the comprehensive nature of Le Prince's vision for film that I really want to sort of draw your attention to, and what I've talked about in the article. You will, on occasion, encounter a brilliant engineer, or a brilliant artist, or a brilliant entrepreneur. But Louis Le Prince was all of these things to an astonishing degree, I think. Now, there's an unfinished novel about the early years of Hollywood by F. Scott Fitzgerald called The Last Tycoon, and it contains this quotation, and it's about an awareness of films. It can be understood, but only dimly and in flashes. Not a half a dozen men have ever been able to keep the whole equation of pictures in their heads. And I believe, and I've tried to express this in the article, that Le Prince was one of the very few people who have ever understood the whole equation of film. But when you realise that he understood this before film even existed, it really becomes a matter of astonishment. And I think that's what's so special about him. And I've not seen that presented before. And so I really hope that this article for the Thoresby Society changes that. And I also hope that the piece finally draws attention to the idea that Leeds, with its resources and its expertise, wasn't just incidental in this, but that Leeds was vital to Le Prince's work, and therefore that Leeds had a genuinely significant role to play in the story of the birth of film. And that's my short piece on Louis Le Prince, and I hope you like the article. And now, great pleasure, I'm going to hand over to Robert Demaine, who's going to talk about Charles Villiers Stanford and the Leeds Choir in Paris.
Thank you very much indeed. I hope I can be heard. That was wonderful. Okay, we've only got a few minutes, so it's going to have to be very quick, I'm afraid. But the article, you can see, relates to a trip to Paris, which is quite well known about in some ways. It does get mentioned in musical histories, but usually more as a footnote than as anything of any great significance. My feeling is that this trip is actually quite a significant one, and it enhances our understanding of both the social and cultural life of Edwardian England and of Leeds itself. So I've only got 10 minutes, and I'll try and give you some of the things that I wasn't able to put in the article because of space constraint. And I think you might be interested to see some images which didn't make their way into the publication, again, due to lack of space. So I'm going to start with looking at the three of the principal dramatis personae of the article. And the first is Stanford himself. If we could have a look at him, there he is with his dates, a contemporary photograph, a leading figure in British art music of the time, professor of music at the Royal College of Music and at Cambridge University, knighted in 1902. He was a massive figure and was part of what was known eventually as the English musical Renaissance, which started possibly in the 1880s and then was still going on in 1906. Now, a lot's been discussed about the English musical Renaissance, but one of the key factors I'd like you to bear in mind when you're reading the article, if you haven't already read it, is the state of English music at the time that this visit was made to Paris. Effectively, English music had been dominated by Austrian and German music for 2 centuries before this time that we're speaking about. The death of Henry Purcell in 1695 effectively could mark a pause in British musical output, because in the following century, Handel was the major figure throughout the 18th century. Haydn visited and had a massive effect at the late 18th century, and then Mendelssohn took over the mantle in the 19th century. And there was no indigenous, really significant musical output. And Stanford and some of his colleagues were very keen indeed on trying to put that right. I have to say that, that it's ironic that both of them, of course, trained in Germany, which is not without a sense of irony there. I'd actually found something interesting the other day, which isn't just my opinion about the domination of German music, but I found a reference to the Royal Philharmonic Society in London, which gave regular concerts. And between 1817 and 1912, which is only a little bit after the time I'm talking about, 1,184 symphonies were actually performed, of which 87% were by Austrian or German composers, which I think gives you an idea of the dominance that was. In fact, what the situation was that England was a net importer of musical talent. We didn't really produce our own in quite the same way. We imported talent. A critic called John Runciman wrote at the time of this Paris trip, he said, "They have given us their music and we have given them our money, and there the matter has ended." But he then went on to say that, of course, this was now changing, and the Paris visit was a first step, or a very early step, in reversing that trend. So Stanford was invited to conduct in Paris by 2 French conductors, and he was very well connected, I must add. Keen though he was to forward the cause of English music, he was a European at heart and had many, many European contacts, and many of his own works were first performed in Germany, strangely enough. So he wasn't an isolationist by any stretch of the imagination. So he was invited to conduct in Paris, and what he wanted to do was to take a choir with him and show the French what an English choir could do. And of course, for that, he chose the best singers in the country at the time, which is in fact the Leeds people. Leeds had already got a fantastic reputation for the excellence of its choirs. It had had that right in the 1880s, 1870s, 80s onwards, and they continued to be admired by all and sundry. And of course, he was well connected with the town because he was the conductor of the Leeds Philharmonic Society. He'd been that since 1897, and he'd also taken over from Sir Arthur Sullivan as a conductor of the Leeds Triennial Leeds Music Festival. He started that in 1901. So, and besides that, he was actually tapping into a general desire for engagement, particularly with France, following the Entente Cordiale, of course, and King Edward VII was extremely keen on fostering those links. So it was a very propitious time indeed for Stanford to consider his undertaking that he proposed. If we can move on to the next slide. This is Dorothy Wilkinson. She was one of the singers, probably the youngest one, 17 years of age at the time, who was involved in the choir, a member of the choir that went. The reason that I'm showing her is because I have acquired, or I came into contact with an archive in which she had kept her memoirs and lots of memorabilia related to this visit that she made as a young girl to Paris in 1906. It was the property of Dr. Edward Huckett of Doncaster, who I met on a couple of occasions. Sadly, he's no longer with us, but he entrusted the archive, Dorothy's archive, to me, and subsequently I've catalogued it and donated it to the Thoresby Society, so it is available to Thoresby Society members for inspection. This is quite remarkable. To me, I got very excited when I first heard about this archive. This kind of archive, a contemporary account, particularly by a young woman, a rank and file member of a choir, is extremely rare and is gold dust to someone like me, certainly. So I was deeply excited to find this. And if you look at the publication, you will see as an appendix, the transcription that I made of her journal is there for you to read, and you can experience the trip in her own words, which is probably better than mine. Could go to the next one. This is the final of the trio of people. Here is John Green, a major player in this whole exercise. Again, I haven't got too much time to talk about him, but he was exactly the kind of man you would need if you were going to organize a trip like this one. He was a successful businessman, and he always had a reputation as a first-class organizer who had meticulous attention to detail, and that's certainly what you need. I do mention some of the things he did to facilitate the journey, but there were lots that there wasn't always space to elaborate on. For example, he engaged a native French speaker to coach the choir in the singing of the Marseillaise, which indeed they didn't know they were necessarily going to sing it, but they did it anyway, and it went down absolutely wonderfully, and the French loved it, as you could well imagine, to sing an English choir singing in decent French. Green enabled that to happen. The train that they went down to London was a corridor train, a through corridor, which is not always the case at that time. And he set up a travel office in the middle of the train with a colleague from the Polytechnic Travel Association to help all the choir and their entourage with tickets, luggage issues, any general inquiries. So he was organized in that sense. He made 2 private visits to Paris in advance of the main one that did it, to look at the venue and make contact with the people who were going to be on the ground during the visit. He also was a kind of belt and braces man who wasn't frightened of doing hard work himself. And there are accounts of him in the Theatre du Châtelet, moving furniture around, measuring up and trying to get the best possible configuration for the choir to sing in. So he was incredibly important. I'm now going to quickly show you, because we are short of time, 2 items of memorabilia from the Huckett archive, which I mentioned. And this is a pocketbook, which was Dorothy's own. As you can see, it says Miss Wilkinson on the top. Every single one of the singers in the Leeds Choir received one of these, and it contained an itinerary. It contained helpful information about traveling around Paris, about currency, everything you'd expect to be able to have as a travel document to accompany on a journey like this. As you can see, it was the Polytechnic Travel Association that actually organized this. This was set up by Regent Street Polytechnic in London in the 1880s and was eventually spun off as a separate company in 1911 after this had happened. And if you're wondering where London Poly came from, the travel firm, no longer exists now, but that's the Poly that this comes from. It's the Regent Street Polytechnic. Just move on to the next one. That's just a ticket that she had. This is called part of the organization. She's got an exact space, an exact place where she will sit and stand in the choir in the Théâtre du Châtelet. This is just the sort of documentation. I love this woman so much. I wish I'd met her. Sadly, she died in 1974. She kept almost everything. A historian loves compulsive collectors. It's absolutely wonderful. So there's lots more of this kind of stuff in the collection. And next one we'll go to. This is the steamer Onward, owned by the Southeastern and Chatham Railway. I show this simply because it does figure in her journal, but also to point out that this journey to Paris would have been almost unthinkable much earlier than it took place because of how long it would take. It was now possible to travel from Leeds to Paris in one rather long single day without having to stop over en route. And one of the reasons was the Onward and ships like her. She was brand new. She'd only just been put into service. And for those who are interested, she was 1,671 gross tons and had twin turbine engines. She could do 22 knots, so she was an absolute greyhound. This was the new super duper channel crossing vehicle. Now, it was said that they were very good in bad weather, but in fact, as you'll read in the article, a lot of people were very, very sick indeed because it was a very bad crossing. So even the lovely ship like that was no help to the poor old choir, most of whom were seasick. The other point to mention is that the railways were much quicker too, and the Great Northern Railway just introduced its latest breed of steam locomotives, which get you from Leeds to London a lot quicker. So the whole thing, although it actually took them 15 hours in total, nearly 15 hours because of things which we'll mention in due course, actually, if you look at the journey times, they were going down rapidly. By 1914, you could actually get from London to Paris in 6 hours, 55 minutes, which compares to, it was over 8 hours in 1957. So it's quite interesting how quickly the Edwardians could move. Okay, if we can move on to the next one. This is an interesting picture. This is the interior of one compartment of the third-class carriage in the North Railway. So this is the one that they boarded in Boulogne at the quayside, and everybody complained bitterly about what it was like. This was courtesy of the archivist of the SNCF who sent me this photo. Look at it. It's absolutely horrendous. Wooden hard bench seats, an oil lamp. It was extremely primitive. And I think this was John Green's great mistake. He didn't realize or twig how bad a third-class compartment could be on the North Railway at that time. It was absolutely terrible. And of course, as you'll read, at least, well, 2 of the coaches caught fire on the way, which is why they had to have a delay. And they also caught fire on the way back. So it was quite common. The French just shrugged at this kind of stuff, but it was an interesting experience. It shows you how tough these choral singers were, though. They went through storm and fire. It was like something out of the magic flute, but it was quite amazing. Next one, please. So this is where they were headed, finally. This is the Théâtre Châtelet, built in 1862 to house at the time 2,200 people, but in fact, it probably took rather more over 3,000. It was used for a variety of events, operetta, variety shows, ballet, and things called féeries, which are a particularly French event, which you could translate it as fairy play. It's a particularly French theatrical genre. It includes music and dance and pantomime and spectacular visual effects. And Dorothy mentions it. She goes to one of these shows on her night off, so to speak, in Paris, called Les 400 Coups du Diable, and that was she didn't know what the hell was going on, but she enjoyed it very much. And interestingly enough, she mentions in the choir having to backstage to thread their way through all kinds of strange things which are all part of the scenery for the show. So that was what that was like. But it wasn't a great place to go, to be honest, although they did give symphony concerts there. It was terrible for singing in, and both the orchestra and the choir complained bitterly about the acoustics, as I do briefly mention. Next one. This is the gilded laurel branch that was presented to the choir by Walter Behrens, who was the president of the British Chamber of Commerce in Paris, on behalf of the British residents there, as a token, affectionate souvenir of their great victories in Paris. It does sound a little bit martial, doesn't it? But it's an interesting thing because this, you can't tell from looking at this, but it was 6 feet tall. Now this diagram is taken, it was published in the Yorkshire Weekly Post, but it was actually taken from a photo which was taken by Messrs James Bacon and Sons, well known, many of you will know Bacon and Sons. If anybody happens to have a library of Bacon's and Sons photographs, maybe you should have a look and see if this appears in it. I'd love to hear from you if you did. But this was presented to the choir as a token of their esteem, and was taken home by Green And as I mentioned in the article, Leeds Art Gallery wouldn't take it, they wouldn't display it or keep it, and so it eventually was lost, which is a great shame. At the bottom, it's the British and French flags in red, white, and blue that are draped around it. And final one, just to finish off, this is just a page from Dorothy's journal, which you can inspect if you wish in the Thorsby Society when we can do that sort of thing again. And it's just like always, any researcher, I always want more. I just wish she had written more. It would have been absolutely wonderful to read more of her preparations before going and what happened to her afterwards. But sadly, that's I'm afraid all we've got. So I'll stop there. I will take questions, obviously, as the rest will afterwards. I'll be very happy to discuss with anybody, and certainly happy to hear if anybody has got any further information about Leeds music of that period. But for now, I'll hand over to Roy Yates, who will talk to us about the Tudor Reformation in Leeds. Roy.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. My contribution on the Tudor Reformation in Leeds is an attempt to assess the unfolding church reforms that took place in the 4 Tudor reigns, from the break with Rome under Henry VIII, 1534, through to the Elizabethan settlement of religion, 1559 and beyond. I tell the national story illustrated by what we know of Leeds in those times. The relevant local sources and documents are few and far between, but it is possible to gather enough evidence from them to tell the Leeds story. Sources I've used include Leeds Parish Church registers and Leeds wills. These are available in the Thorsby Society publications. Chantry certificates and the Elizabethan 1559 visitation books. These are available in publications from the Surtees Society and from Ralph Thorsby's Vicaria Leodiensis. So I want to give a flavour of my article. One of the most significant developments was the change in the appearance of the interior of Leeds Parish Church. Under the reforms, images, crosses, candles, solemn religious processions, and prayers for the souls of the departed were done away with. The daily offering of the Mass, with all its ritual and colour, was replaced with the English services of the Book of Common Prayer. Some thought they were rather dull. The many side chapels, with their altars and chantry foundations, became redundant. There is evidence that the partitions between the chapels were removed. Images were taken down, leaving only the plinths on which they'd stood. The new emphasis on preaching meant that there was need for more seating in the church, so that the congregation could listen to a sermon from a prominent pulpit. These changes are illustrated by the case of Christopher Jackson, a leading layman in the parish. He took part with 13 other men in a purge of the church interior when images were removed and destroyed. They were accused of railing against the sacrament and burning an image of the Virgin Mary. The case was brought against them later on in the reign of Queen Mary by the church wardens, and it does show that there was a serious religious division in the town at the time. I also want to draw attention to the Elizabethan clergy at Leeds Parish Church and the contrast between Alexander Fawcett, who was there from 1559 to 1589. He was a priest ordained under the old order and who had to adapt from a daily celebration of the Mass to the new services of the Book of Common Prayer. The contrast between him and Robert Cook, his successor, who was vicar from 1590 to 1615. He was invited to come to Leeds as vicar from Oxford after the townspeople had purchased the advowson, that is, the right to appoint the vicar. In contrast to Fawcett, he offered a ministry based on what they call godly preaching. Hard luck for those who had to sit through the great long sermons. Fawcett and Cook filled the post of vicar to the end of the reign of Elizabeth I, and on to more stable times, to the establishment of an Anglican tradition of churchmanship. I just wanted to give those few points of introduction to my article, and I will leave it there. I hope you enjoy reading it. Thank you.
Well, can I thank all the speakers for their really excellent and interesting contributions. We're now open for questions. On the chat function, there's one comment and one question, and these are directed at Robert. Linda says she found it really interesting. I sing with the Leeds Phil Society, 150th anniversary this year. I found the footnotes as interesting as some of the text. Leeds still makes great contribution to British music. And then we have a question from Janet. Have you any interest in the follow-up visit to Paris in 1912 when the choir sang External Father, Strong to Save, whilst the Titanic was sinking? We have some limited information in the Leeds Philharmonic own archive. Over to you, Robert.
Well, the answer is yes, I would be interested in the 1912 visit. I didn't mention it in the article. Well, I did mention it briefly, actually, that John Green did go back, in fact, in 1912. He'd had enough in 1906 and didn't want to go back for a very long time. But yes, I wasn't aware that the Leeds Phil had got enough of archival material. I'd be very interested to know what that was. Very interesting you should mention the Titanic, because, of course, the LSO played with Leeds on this occasion, and spinning off from that, they were doing tours all over the place, and they were booked to go to America, and they were booked to go on the Titanic, and then there was a last minute change of plan and they changed to a different ship. It could have been a very different history had that not happened. But yes, I would be very pleased to if they'd like to get in contact with me about that.
Do we have any more questions? If you can either use the chat function, or what I would suggest is if you unmute yourself, and then you can ask your question verbally. Any questions? There's been a lot of information and perhaps a lot too much for people to enjoy, but there's a message here. I really enjoyed this event. Thank you to all the speakers and organisers. Just looking out, so I missed that, the end of that comment. Just looking out at Leeds Minster from my office window. That's a nice place to be.
Thank you. I wondered if I could ask Roy if there's any available plans of the parish church before it became before the actual Reformation.
There are some drawings of the parish church. One of them published in Ralph Thoresby's Vicaria, and then we have some at the Thoresby Society archives. We have some paintings of the interior of the parish church before it was demolished in 1837 for W.F. Hook's rebuild.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Any more questions from anybody? Well, if not, then it just falls to me to conclude the meeting, first of all, by thanking Chris Hindle for putting together such an excellent volume, and our four speakers, Chris, Irfan Shah, Robert Demaine and Roy Yates, for those really excellent contributions. As I said at the start of the meeting, members of the Society should already have the volume and will be able to read the articles in full, and I will shortly circulate details which would enable those of you who are not yet members to buy your own copy, and we're offering you it at a post-free bargain price this time. And then finally, can I just advertise our next two meetings? We have a meeting next Monday when it's called Members Talks, and there are two shorter talks, as you can see, from Anthony Ram on Leeds and its history in the Central Library Connections, and Michael Medicross, Gabriel Davis, and the establishment of the Jewish community in Leeds. And then in about a fortnight's time, we have another book launch for David Thornton's Leeds, a Biographical Dictionary. We're very glad to see you at those events. And if you'd like the Zoom link, just send me a short email. I will respond to emails asking for the link, acknowledging them, and then you'll get the link the day before the meeting. So I can conclude now by ending the meeting, thanking everyone for taking part, again, thanking our speakers, and I hope everyone has an enjoyable year in 2021, and I hope the Thorsby Society will add some interest to your life during that year. Thank you very much to everybody.